and today we're relaunching our report about community town centres. We're really pleased to have you all with us. Before we get started, just a few words on Centre for London and why we're holding this event. I can see from some of the people in the audience and indeed some of our panellists that you know us very well, so I promise I won't labour this too much. We're London's dedicated think tank. We develop new solutions to London's critical challenges, and we advocate for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global city. We publish research, stage events like this one, and maybe, who knows, later in this year, some face-to-face ones as well, and we convene and influence. This is a slightly unusual event for us today in that the report was largely written by my former colleague Joe Wills, who's now in the policy team at Haringey Council. So my huge thanks to Joe for all the work that he's done with this project, and I know that many people in the panel and in the audience will have worked with Joe as well. My colleague Nikita, who's joined us a bit more recently, has bravely agreed to present the research today, despite not having been involved in writing it. So thank you very much for Nikita for taking on that slightly intimidating task. We're really looking forward to your presentation. This project explores how London's local communities can play an active role in the stewardship and governance of their high streets and town centres to make them more resilient and sustainable. There's loads of reasons to be bothered about this, and we'll talk about them more through the course of the session, but I think this is a really, really important time as we emerge from the pandemic to really take this question seriously and think about how we want our high streets to work and who needs to be involved in making them work. We did lots of literature reviewing. There were some really interesting case studies in the report, which I'd very much recommend having a look at. Some data analysis, including some interesting new work with the Estates Gazette, looking at property ownership and the relationship between who owns properties and how likely they are to be vacant on our high streets is really important. And we spoke to lots of key stakeholders, including many of you in the audience, town centre partnerships, community groups, local and central governments and business improvement districts. So I think this is one of the pieces of research that we've done that has got the most interest from people outside of Centre for London in all sorts of different roles. And I think that's testament to how important this discussion is to have now. It's building on previous work that we've done on how to involve local people in decision making about their areas, and that's all still really important and relevant, but the context has changed. We'll talk a little bit today about how that context has changed and what that means for the challenges and the opportunities that we have. Before we move on to the webinar and to Nikita's presentation, I'd like to thank very much the sponsors of this project, our good growth partner Transport for London, funders the National Association of Local Councils and Power to Change, and major sponsors for Greater London Authority and Primera. And we're really pleased today to have Tom from Transport for London and Vidhya from Power to Change joining us on the panel as well. Now I'd like to introduce Nikita Quarshie, our researcher here at Centre for London, who's going to present the findings of this report. Thank you very much, Nikita.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for passing on the baton. So I'm Nikita, a researcher at Centre for London. And I'm really pleased to be sharing some of the insights from this report, especially because it feels like it's in conversation with some of our previous projects, notably public involvement in planning, at the heart of which was the idea that communities should play a meaningful role in the development and future of London, and that doing so quite simply just leads to a better city. And this, of course, becomes even more important and relevant in the context of our high streets and town centres, which serve as the centre of our neighbourhoods, but which has for several years been on life support. So it's been exactly 10 years since the Porter's Review declared high streets to be in crisis. And since then, several national initiatives have sought to address issues highlighted in that report. However, it now feels like we're at a particular point of urgency, given the continuation of certain challenges posed in the report and the emergence of new ones, particularly as we look towards a post-pandemic London. Chief among them is the decline of retail and the closure of major retailers on our high streets and within our town centres. And of course, now we know that online sales make up a significant portion of total retail sales, and e-commerce is expected to keep growing. Another key challenge is the changes to planning controls and the impact of the extension of permitted development rights, which makes conversions from commercial uses to residential more common and easier, thus threatening the vibrancy of our high streets. There's also the issue of delinquent ownership. So about a third of vacant units on high streets are owned by property companies who are arguably less concerned about being responsible stewards and ensuring that they're part of a wider ecosystem that serves all users of our high streets. And at this point, it feels like a bit of a cliche to say, but the pandemic really has exacerbated these issues, especially as the way we live and work has been forced to evolve. And it's revealed certain pressure points for London's high streets, while also reinforcing the vital roles that they can and do play in our neighbourhoods. So as we know, city centres in particular have been heavily impacted by the pandemic. So there's Google mobility data shows a much more significant drop in movement in central London compared to boroughs in outer London at the beginning of this year, as London faced its third lockdown. This very much aligns with the findings from our London intelligence report, which at the beginning of the pandemic showed a sharp decrease in travel to offices and non-essential places as a result of the restrictions, naturally given a boost to local high streets and local town centres, which have become much more important and which have become focal areas for food shop and other essential services, even more so than before. And public spaces and public areas have also become more important, like our parks. The pandemic has also highlighted that Londoners value and contribute to their communities. So the beginning of the pandemic saw people mobilizing fairly quickly and taking action to support one another. So anecdotally, we know about the growth of mutual aid groups within our own communities, our own areas, but across London more generally. A London intelligence data again shows that a significant amount of people believe that others help each other out. And this has stayed largely consistent throughout the pandemic and highlights a desire for people to play a role within their communities and contribute not just their resources, but also their time. Additionally, new and arguably better relationships have begun to form between organizations, and other ways of working together have proved to be more desirable. Now, crucially, high streets and town centres have often acted as focal places for organising and providing support through the presence of mutual aid centres and food banks, and allowing communities to take advantage of vacant units for meanwhile uses. In this way, the pandemic has highlighted something which in a sense has always been true, which is that high streets have always been more than just places to shop. They have diverse uses and functions. They're places where people live, work, and also play. And I think it's quite important to reinforce this given the current challenges high streets face. And when thinking about rejuvenating our town centres into moving beyond outdated retail models to become more diverse, multifunctional spaces of community activity. So of course, generally there's a consensus that the high street does need a renewal. And this report makes the case that meaningful community involvement will play a crucial role in ensuring that this goal becomes achievable and helps deliver a collective vision for the future of our high streets and town centres. This is because meaningful community involvement generates social and economic value, though there's a tendency to see the two as mutually exclusive. However, these values are very much interconnected. So firstly, communities play a role in articulating what is desired by local people, what the issues of the high streets are, and what needs to change in order to attract people to the high street. Meaningful community involvement enables us to reveal the value that's already in place. And this is important to ensure that you don't jeopardize the good that's already there. Also creates diverse and attractive places with a variety of users that ensure the density of employment and opportunities for local people. And diverse and attractive places also have an indirect impact on our health and well-being. Meaningful community involvement also leads to the creation and growth of community businesses that are intentional and designed with a commitment to place and with a social purpose. So our report provides some case study that demonstrates the interrelation between social and economic value. One of my favorite is the Latin elephant case study. And it's an example of a registered charity established to support the participation and inclusion of migrant and ethnic minority-led small businesses in urban regeneration at Elephant and Castle, Southwark, which is quite local to me. So this work was important in giving visibility to businesses that was a source of employment and enterprise for communities, and serving as a source of community in its own self. Another great aspect of the collective and the organization was that they empowered traders to advocate and speak for themselves. And I think this is really important, especially considering that Latin Americans in London have been historically unrecognized as an ethnic minority in policy and don't even count as an ethnic group in official data, despite facing economic and social marginalization. So the Latin elephant case study shows how important it is to give visibility to social and economic ecosystems within particular areas and ensure that they have a place in the regeneration that occurs within those areas. Another really great example and case study from the report is shows how communities can play a role in restoring high streets. And this was seen with the case of the Nudge Community Builders in Plymouth, who are a community benefit society set up by local people who had been active volunteers in the community for many years. So the high street in the area, Union Street, had suffered decline over a number of years, with several grand buildings becoming run down. So the organization grew out of a project to bring a disused shop on the street back into use, and which was made successful with a crowdfunding campaign. Since then, they've gone on to acquire more properties, and they've created a desire among local people to see more vacant buildings brought into use. So what then makes for good community involvement? I suppose at this point, it feels almost natural to want some sort of blueprint or a type of institutional design of what good community involvement in our high streets would look like. And our report does share the different kind of forms and structures that meaningful involvement may take and look like, including the role that community improvement districts can play. However, what becomes quite clear is that the type of participation or the type of community improvement districts that will work will really depend on the area, on the people involved, the relationships and activities that already exist in the area. So in a sense, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really exist and doesn't really work. However, there are some key principles that should guide the process and which in the end become more important than the structure itself. Chief among them is starting with what's already there, so tapping into existing networks rather than trying to develop something new. It also means building and developing good relationships and mediating between different interests and valuing local leadership. Again, another key principle is knowing how to build consensus, which requires the honing of certain skills such as interpersonal and conflict resolution skills. And of course, it means securing revenue. However, it doesn't have to be on a large or grand scale or amount. And that there are examples of community groups bringing together small amounts of funding to do quite impressive work. An example and a case study that I love from the reports that kind of reflects these principles is Co-Place Nottingham, which is a partnership between Nottingham City Council, community organisers, Islington and Alchemy, and shows the benefits of adopting community organising principles rather than more traditional or formal processes or ways of working. One way this was manifested was the social eating approach, which you can see in the picture. And I think it's a great approach because it shows participants coming together in quite an informal setting and in an egalitarian way, but also in a very much enjoyable way. So this process doesn't have to be seen as arduous or something to just be gone through, but it can be enjoyable and it can lead to the development of relationships based on trust, balance of power, and one which breaks down barriers. So with all this in mind, our report has put together a series of recommendations which requires a genuine partnership between all town centre and high street stakeholders, including private, public and community sectors all coming to work together. Our recommendations to government, specifically in supporting successful high street renewal, is reconsidering the extension of permitted development rights, reviewing the powers of local authorities to bring long-term vacant commercial properties back into use, and build on existing programs to fund high street strategies. The report also makes recommendations to local authorities on how to give communities more say over the high street's future, and provides recommendations on how different community groups and partnerships can do these for themselves. one of the values of the report is relaying the importance of doing so now and mobilizing around the particular energy and momentum for a deep reimagining and a deeper and collective vision of what London's high streets and what our neighborhoods can become as we enter a post-pandemic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. That was fantastic. Really interesting report. And thank you again for stepping in and presenting something that you weren't initially involved in. In terms of the format of the rest of the event, our panelists will now share their response to the research. We'll get a bit of a discussion going. We'll take some questions from the audience. You'll already see that my colleague Deanna has put in the chat how you can get involved. Please ask your questions in the Q&A box. If you can see somebody has asked a question that's a little bit like the question that you've already asked, please upvote that question rather than asking another one. That makes it much easier for me to see which of the areas that are of particular interest to people and put those to the panelists. And if you're following us on YouTube, please use the Twitter hashtag to feed in, and one of my colleagues will then add those questions to the Q&A. You're welcome to use the chat to share events and resources, but we won't necessarily be able to look at all of it, so the Q&A is the place to put things that you'd like us to respond to. Really pleased to be joined today by three absolutely excellent panelists. Vidhya Alakeson is the Chief Executive from Power to Change. I'm sure she needs no introduction to many of you. She is an absolutely brilliant speaker and very kindly comes to quite a number of our Centre for London events. She's worked at a number of think tanks in government in both the UK and the US, and before she set up Power to Change, Vidhya was the Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, another really interesting and important think tank working on issues that affect low and middle income families. Next up, we have Tom Sykes, who has kindly agreed to step in and speak today at the last minute due to a staffing change. So we're very grateful to Tom for doing that, although since he was involved in the advisory group for this project, I'm sure he will be brilliantly positioned. Tom is the Quality and Design Lead at Transport for London's Commercial Development section, where he does his biography says that he combines design sensitivity with project management and delivery skills, and has delivered award-winning housing, cultural and mixed-use schemes. TfL's commercial development arm is perhaps less well known than other parts of it, but it really does do some very interesting work. He was an associate in the first public practice cohort. We work a lot with the public practice associates here at Centre for London. They're an absolutely brilliant group. And now as an alumni, he's still contributing to that network. I think this might be the second or third event in this year where I've had public practice associates or alumni as part of the discussion. So we're really grateful to you for being here, Tom. And last but by no means least, we have Caroline Wilson, who's the Director of Inclusive Economy and Jobs and the Community Wealth Building Programme at Islington Council. Caroline leads Islington's Economic Development Programme. There's so much interesting work there that we can talk about, focusing on jobs for local people and building wealth at a community level through progressive business support, through procurement and asset management approaches. And she previously worked at Belfast City Council for over 15 years, so she can bring us a really interesting perspective on the differences between between work in different parts of the UK. We're going to move over to Vidhya now, and please do start asking questions in the Q&A, and thank you very much to people who've already done that. It's very brave of you to go first, so thank you for that. Vidhya, coming to you, can you tell us a little bit about Power to Change and the role of community businesses?
Sure, thanks Claire. And first of all, I'd like to really welcome this report, and we were very pleased to support it, but its findings and conclusions are excellent, about particularly this focus on the critical role of communities in terms of high street regeneration is something we really support. So Power to Change, as some of you will know, is an independent trust established about 6 years ago now to support community businesses. So we define community businesses as locally rooted businesses that are run by local people and trade for the benefit of the local economy, the local community of the place. What in the context of high streets, I think we see two really critical roles for community businesses. So one is as long-term stewards, as owners of properties on the high street. And what we see from the hundreds of community businesses that we support is that they are very much wanting to be long-term stewards of assets in their local communities and hold those and run those for long-term benefit for the local community and the place. And your findings and work that we did previously shows that that's not generally the case with many owners of high street properties. They are often absent, they are remote, and they're not necessarily interested in the viability and the future of the place. I mean, Caroline hopefully will talk about the amazing work that Islington's doing as a local authority in the same way as long-term stewards of property on the high street. But community businesses are playing a very active role on that front. The other front that's really important is their role as animators of space. So we have this growing problem now of empty properties as the retail backbone of the high street is in decline. We have hundreds of examples of community businesses taking on those empty properties, reanimating them, bringing alternative uses to the high street. So that mix of uses that we now need, moving away from purely retail and largely commercial uses. And we commissioned some work last year from the LSE, which looked at the impact of community businesses on the high street. And they identified a number of things which I think are sort of really critical. First, they drive footfall. So by reanimating space, they bring people back to the high street. There's a reason to go to the high street. But also they create diversity on the high street. So the range of different uses that they bring to the high street actually draw different kinds of people in from the people who would otherwise use the high street, whether that's difference by age or by diversity. They're growing the number of people that use the high street. We've got strong evidence that they support local economic development. So over 50% of the money that they generate, the revenue from community businesses, is reinvested back into that local community. So it's not going to shareholders elsewhere, it's going back into the local community. So in terms of building up that local economic base, they are really important. And overall, those things combine to create place resilience. And I think one of the things that's really come through in the pandemic is that the current model of the retail backbone of high streets and town centres has demonstrated itself to not be very resilient. So when the really big challenge of the pandemic came, actually what we found was that our town centres and high streets were really vulnerable. And those that fared better were those that were more locally rooted in kind of independent and community-led businesses. And those have endured much better, and that will continue to be the case given changes in working patterns. So that's what our experience of what community businesses can really bring to this agenda.
Thanks, Vidhya. That was so interesting. And yeah, I think we know we're coming up to possibly higher rates of properties moving into disuse as rental holidays that have been in place during the pandemic come to an end, and possibly as furlough support from the government starts to be withdrawn more steeply. So this does feel like such an important time to talk about this. I expect, Vidhya, that there are people in the audience today who are maybe professionally, maybe personally thinking, well, I really like my local high street, but I don't feel like it's quite what it was, or I feel like it could be better and I'd like to get involved. Understanding, of course, that every high street circumstance is different and every individual circumstance is different. What advice or guidance would you give to them?
I think there are two key bits. One is join up with other people. So this isn't something that you can do individually. It's very difficult to do it individually. And really the strength of community businesses comes from that collective community effort to change a place. So finding those fellow travellers locally who really want to change things is, I think, the starting point, and developing a vision then for what you want the future to look like. Just as an example, is one of the most exciting community-led regeneration efforts on the high street at the moment is Mid-Steeple Quarter in Dumfries in Scotland. And that is they've created a very exciting vision for what the future of their quite moribund high street will look like. And it's mixed use, it's retail, it's workspace, it's housing, and it's drawing a lot of now capital towards them as an organisation to revitalise their high street. So finding those other people in your local community who both have the passion but also the skills, because there are a lot of skills that you need to make this happen. The other thing that I think is absolutely critical is making friends with the local authority. So these are doing this, we did some work recently with about 40 community leaders, and it's quite disheartening, I think, that the vast majority of them say that most of what they achieve is in spite of the current system and the people who hold power rather than because of them. So we could do a lot better to enable community-led action on numerous fronts. But the reality is, in our experience, that the projects that work best are ones where community organisations and local residents work in partnership with local authorities. They've got the ability to enable staff to do asset transfer, to provide small grants for feasibility. there's a whole range of things that can work so much better in partnership. So actually trying to find the right person in the local authority who you can work with to get a seat around the table where those decisions are being made about the future of the high street. I mean, ultimately, it sounds sort of almost trite to say this because it's so much harder to do than it is to say, but the future of the high street is about those public-private community partnerships, as your report identified. So rather than sort of doing this alone as community organisations, doing this in partnership with other stakeholders in the local area is the better way forward, although often that's not what's happening in practice, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Vidhya. That's so interesting, and I'm sure we'll come on to more of those points as we talk to Tom and Caroline, and maybe come back later to talk a little bit more about examples. But for now, I'd like to move over to Tom, please. Tom, I think some people in the audience might be a little bit surprised to have Transport for London here talking about community involvement. It's maybe not something that they'll particularly associate with that organisation. So to start with, I wondered if you could share why you're interested in this agenda. I mean, obviously it's terribly important and everybody should be interested, but why are you specifically interested?
I think, yeah, really good question. Transport for London's changed a reasonable amount over the last several years, obviously providing transport infrastructure, but we're also one of London's largest landowners, and we've started to look at that portfolio of land, identifying where it is. It's so close to town centres, and those stations, you know, often they sit literally geographically in the heart of the town centre, but are surrounded by things that don't necessarily contribute to the social or community life. So large car parks, some of which are quite underused, or old buildings that could really do with some looking after works sites that have been abandoned for a long time. And so we've been looking to develop sort of housing-led predominantly, but mixed use and commercial schemes on that land. And it is something quite unusual for TfL to be doing. And we recognise completely that at the scale of those schemes and that development, we need to understand the ecosystem and the communities and the place around them. Because we recognise that's pretty urgently important. We've worked with Daisy Froud to help develop a community engagement handbook to let us and our development team understand how at the early stages of projects we can start to get that information and intelligence about community and start to build those relationships. And then I think that also applies to the other side of the estate that we look after, our existing estate. So our arches, some of our commercial buildings around. These are like really well occupied and used parts of the infrastructure of the kind of on the ground city. You might be going over them on your trains, but beneath you are car mechanics and, well, I mean, they're incredible what you can get in an arch. I've seen a swimming pool inside an arch, not just sort of glitzy gin distilleries. And I think so combining that small scale all the way up to our larger sites like Edgware or Morden, where we're looking at real town centres of the next 25, 30, 50, 100 years. Yeah, all of that is why engaging and working with our communities is completely essential to working out what to do next.
Thanks, Tom. It's nice to hear you talk about Edgware. I spent many teenage hours there doing things that were mostly very reasonable for me to do, and some of them perhaps a little bit less reasonable, but you're right.
We'll leave some backspaces for you, Claire.
I think I've been there for about 20 years, but yes, an interesting place. So following up from that, Tom, you talked about TfL as a property owner, obviously quite an unusual one. What's your view on what property owners can do to facilitate greater community involvement? And linked to that, I guess, has that changed? Has the way you see this changed as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think hearing Vidhya talking about this stewardship role is really important to how we see. I mean, we're looking after these public assets, and I think it's very frustrating to see property developers not thinking in that way, thinking in a slightly shorter term way. I mean, it's like, I was thinking about this quite a lot this morning. I think there's 5 things. Like the first is so obvious, but stop seeing the community as a risk. And if you're worried about talking to the community about what you're doing, you've probably got a good reason to be worried, and you should probably start to look at yourself as well and the work you're doing, as well as talking to that community and hearing directly from them what they think. Obviously start early, but be really explicit about what you can engage on. I think with with TfL, we have certain requirements that are set, targets for housing. The Mayor's transport strategy, we provide 50% affordable homes across our land. There are constraints that we can't shift, but there are an awful lot of things that we do want to talk about. And I think if you go to communities early and are transparent about what is available to be discussed, what is important, then it leads on to the next thing, that it's not about winning support, it's about gaining a kind of respect. And I think as a public authority, that's really important. But even as like a long-term landowner in a place, having that kind of respect, even if people don't agree 100% with what you're doing, is going to build better relationships for the future. I mean, that you're going to have that more open dialogue that hopefully means that your interaction with a high street can be kind of more embedded. Share what you're up to and keep on doing it. You know, if you've taken comments, tell people what you've done with them as well. A really easy thing to do, especially now. I mean, you know, set up an Instagram account that tells people exactly what their information has gone towards. And I think what's been really helpful for us is working with really good engagement specialists. So I think there are some types of design teams that have a real handle and understanding on engaging with communities, and especially the first few times you do this, it's really worth getting people who can do that and kind of, I don't know, show you the types of behavior and actions that can really help foster relationships. I'll be really quick on touching on the pandemic stuff. The way we've been thinking about our town centre projects has been a case of, well, you will start now, but these won't be complete for decades. They will take a long time to realise. And what we've seen is that everything that's been happening around the pandemic has accelerated some of those trends that we'd started to see before. But we think it's quite exciting. A bunch of research that we did looking at kind of how you combine these education and well-being, streetscape, homes all together in really dense and mixed places suddenly feels hugely relevant, like not kind of, oh wow, that's crazy stuff, but actually on these projects right now with the development partners we're talking to, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're all hoping to look at. And we really want to see that joining up across our organisation of how transport infrastructure works with that people stop seeing a bus stop outside something as a negative, but as an amazing positive. It's like a focal point of interaction. And if you can make the streetscape really wide, generous and pleasant there as well, then that can link up to maybe civic amenities. Why isn't that library tucked within a building that's also got shops and homes above it? The other side of this is to do with our arches, and we've had an opportunity to change a little bit our approach there, and we're moving with a lot of our tenants towards turnover rents, which is giving a lot more resilience to their business, but it also means we're totally committed to them doing well. It means we're starting to build those networks across the city of like-minded businesses who can share skills, like taking site visits out to a really successful use of an arch somewhere with other tenants who are thinking about moving in is completely eye-opening. But it's also allowing us to look at our portfolios of arches rather than like, that one's empty, quick fit it out, get someone new in. We're now doing sort of asset plans that are starting to look at those areas for the next 20 years. And then that's meaning that we're then going to start engaging with our communities. I think the one that's on our target straight away is Kilburn, and around Kilburn Station there's wonderful sets of arches that could do so much more for that high street. And we're just starting to piece together the ways that we can work to do that. So I think, you know, having this report, it is so useful for me to kind of share around our wider team, to share with our potential partners, design teams, and also communities. Like, this is how we want to engage as a landowner that's sort of sitting between that community and that authority setting.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Tom. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in Kilburn. As you say, it's a space with so much potential. Coming to you now, Caroline. You're obviously you've got a very exciting job title at Islington, really interesting work. Can you tell us a little bit about Islington's approach to an inclusive economy and how this relates to your high streets as a borough?
Sure, Claire, and I mean, like Vidhya and Tom, very much welcome this report, because I think it is very much about people at the centre of this, and that very much is what we do in Islington. It's about a community development approach to economic development. It has people at its heart. It's about social justice. It's really about trying to kind of make real that fairness agenda on our high streets and on our local economies. And Vidhya used the word stewards, and I think that's really important. I also think another word that local authorities should use more is facilitation. And we have a team of fantastic local economy officers who work right across the borough. And I very much see their role as facilitating relationships. So it is about kind of making the connections at a very local level that really kind of progresses our agenda around fairness and kind of that distribution of wealth and opportunity within local areas, but kind of making those connections where we can, for instance, during the pandemic, we had one of our affordable workspace operators. They were able to set up an app that helped local businesses kind of redistribute food whenever they went into lockdown to local food banks and to local charities. We had another amazing business who wanted to print 3D face shields. So again, our local economy officer was able to connect them into the local NHS and into our own council. So for me, that kind of connection and kind of connection making is so critical to kind of that inclusive economy approach that we have in Islington.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Carol. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but to ask you a similar question to what I asked Tom, why are you bothered as a local authority specifically about high streets at the moment?
Well, high streets are absolutely the kind of central understanding of how people experience economy. So, what you see down the high street, where you can go, what the opportunities are there, that is for very many people, that is how they experience our economy. So local economies are central to kind of rebuilding out of the pandemic. And I think for us, there are 4 kind of key areas that we're concerned about, and they also present opportunities. But I mean, really, the consumer element, where people's consumer habits have fundamentally changed and going online, and that kind of, and the collapse of some of the big anchors who are on our high streets, and how we make sure that there's a reason for people to go back to their high streets, and also making sure that it's a safe place, because ultimately people have avoided high streets because they didn't feel safe. So those kind of consumer habits have really are impacting on high streets. I think another thing that's important for Islington is office workers. It's very easy to say, as I sit here in my back bedroom, we're not going to go to the office now for maybe 2 days a week. That is a 40% drop in the local coffee shops income, and those margins just don't exist in the little local laundrette that's on the corner of the Farringdon station, and that has a really big impact on the jobs that kind of sit around that. So for me, kind of that managing that office worker, particularly down in the central activity zone of central London, is really critical. I think another big area that we're looking at is around employers' behaviours. So as Vidhya said, the kind of collapse of the high street very quickly overnight, that was a lot of people's livelihoods. So people who work in sort of relatively precarious employment in hospitality and retail, they very much saw those jobs disappear. So as we rebuild and as we kind of start to recruit back, are there things that we can do around ensuring that those jobs are more secure, that they're better paid, that they have progression, that we're able to give skills to people and that they can progress through their work. And the final piece that really kind of concerns us, which Nikita mentioned, was around the government legislation, and that the extension of permitted development rights, that has deeply undermines local authorities' ability to curate a local area, to kind of hold on to employment, because as Tom says, the kind of quick win at the moment for landlords who see tenants who are carrying a lot of debt as they come out of the pandemic, the quick win is to convert to housing. Those are jobs lost on the high street. Those are spaces that you won't get back for 20, 30 years. So that kind of how we work with landlords is a real challenge for us, because there are good landlords. There are landlords in the Angel, in Nag's Head, who supported their tenants through this pandemic. So, you know, how do we amplify what they're doing, and how do we kind of connect with those landlords who we really need to control as much as we can within the legislation available to us?
That's fantastic, thank you. And yeah, couldn't agree more about the dangers of permitted development. This is not an anti-housing position, I think. I suspect that everybody here is very pro-housing, but we need a good balance to create the spaces that people who live in those homes actually want to be part of. So it does feel important, particularly as for boroughs like Islington, changes to the central possibility of changes to the central activity zone potentially move that issue further into central London. We've got loads of really important questions. So before we move on to those questions, I'm just going to ask Caroline, Vidhya and Tom for very briefly one really good example of community engagement in high streets or local economy that you know about but you'd like to share with the group. Caroline, if I could come to you first.
We've loads obviously in Islington, but I mean, I think partnership is absolutely the way forward. The one that I would really draw on it's in the report. It's an amazing partnership we have with Fashion Enter, who are one of our affordable workspace operators. They really work at a very grassroots level with local communities, bringing in local women who've often been excluded from the kind of labour market, and building skills, through a long lease that we've taken on the Fonthill Road, able to really promote people's designs. So it's not about kind of the lovely universities, and they're fantastic universities, but it is about local people being able to present their local designs on their local high street, and really kind of, it's an amazing partnership. So I highly recommend people to go to Fonthill Road and purchase there. That's mine, Claire.
Thank you, Caroline. Vidhya, can I come to you next?
Yeah, so we haven't talked much about public services on the high street, which is another important dimension. So I'm going to Upper Norwood Library Hub. I thought it was better to do a London example. There's many from across the country, but as a really interesting example of an asset transfer from the local authority, and then turning a former public library into a community hub. It continues to be a library service. It continues to offer that, but it also offers the community a whole range of other things, which is increasing footfall in the local area and bringing new people to the high street. So it's actually like many libraries on the high street in the town centre. So the way in which we can also use public services as part of this, and communities playing a role in that, is also really important and something we haven't touched on. So that's my example.
Thanks, Vidhya. And I'm at risk of saying about everything that gets mentioned today. Oh yeah, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? But it's fairly local to me, the Upper Norwood Library Hub, and it's been really interesting, even just from the outside, seeing how it's changed and developed and just how dynamic and diverse it appears now. So it's been a very exciting one to watch. Tom, over to you next. If you've got something you'd like to share, it may not be quite the right question for you.
No, it's one that I use with my team, is the East's work for Borough High Street, and that kind of forensic mapping of who owns every single plot and site, not who's a tenant, but working your way back up to the landlord, finding out how a small bit of money can make a difference to a frontage. And then I think it just stands so lovely in the test of time, that care of that public realm, of adding in little bits that don't quite fit. It's not newly paved and flush and lovely. They just knew that it was going to get ripped up again and again and again by services. And so all of those interventions are a bit random. They say people's names, they point to little bits of history. And it just feels like it has lasted really well over 15 years now. I think pointing people towards that within my team has been a really helpful way of seeing, oh, that's what these things look like in the long term.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think it's really striking with those examples that none of these are kind of shiny and perfect. They're real and a little bit gritty, and sometimes they don't look kind of corporate, but that's because they are reflecting the needs of their community. Moving on to some of the questions asked by the audience now, and thank you to everybody who's asked us a question. Got a couple of linked ones to start with, to do with neighbourhood planning and the role it can play in supporting the high street. And particularly given, as one of our questioners said, that some London councils have obstructed neighbourhood planning groups for a while, and how do we overcome that kind of political veto? Vidhya, I wonder if you'd like to have a go at that one. I suspect it's something that comes up for you sometimes.
Yes, I'm always reluctant. I know Tony Burton is on the webinar to talk about neighbourhood planning when you've got like a country expert on the webinar. So I think this is so yes, I think there is scope for both neighbourhood planning to do more within town centres, and there was funding this year from MHCLG to encourage more neighbourhood forums to take up neighbourhood planning that would impact on town centre regeneration. I think people tend to not see it in that context, but that is a viable scope for neighbourhood planning. I think one of the things I'm interested in is the extent to which neighbourhood forums could develop into community improvement districts over time. So where you've already got an established forum, could that bring other stakeholders in to evolve over time to a community improvement district? I think one of the things that's interesting about this whole space is really around the role of governance. So the report, which I agree with, sort of says, you can't, starting with the governance mechanism isn't the right way to think about it. You need to start with the vision and then develop a partnership and then potentially formalize that partnership into a governance mechanism. And I do agree with that. I think one of the challenges in the community space is that unless there is a formal governance mechanism that enables communities to have a say and have a stake, their ability to participate is very much sort of at the request of other stakeholders who generally have more power than them in the system. And we can see from neighbourhood planning that even where you do have a legal right to participate, that can be blocked by local authorities that don't want to really enable neighbourhood planning. But I still feel that actually having some formal governance routes through which communities have a right to participate and a right to a seat around the table is in the end helpful, even if it's not the starting point, and it won't fix everything. There is clearly no silver bullet in the high streets debate that's going to sort everything out. But I think the challenge otherwise is that you have to be invited in by the local authority or by a major developer, etc. The opportunity of something like the evolution of neighbourhood forums into community improvement districts gives communities an opportunity, I think, to drive some of this where there may be a sort of resistance. But we do know that the resistance can be quite significant in certain local authorities.
Thanks, Vidhya. Really interesting. And yeah, I think we talked about this a lot working through the report. I think the question about whether you do sort of local areas first or governance models first is a really profound and interesting one. Space for lots of different views and lots of different approaches. And I agree that there's not going to be a silver bullet, but we will keep working to try to discover one that might exist. Caroline, I wonder if you'd like to come in there.
I mean, I would totally agree with Vidhya on that. And speaking from experience in Belfast, often the people who get organised first have, there's a kind of degree of keeping out others, and I think that organic sort of partnership growth is far more important than the formal governance, and making sure that it is an inclusive process. It is about bringing in new people, and sometimes that rush to formal structures kind of precludes that. And then there are fantastic neighbourhood planning forums, absolutely, but I have seen it where it is about keeping people out, and it is about kind of the power that I hold to keep you out and to stop you having a say. And I think for us, in terms of business improvement districts and community improvement districts, I think that's the thing that we would look for, is always making sure that the voice that's least heard in a local area is the voice that's kind of at the centre of the table, not just at the table, but at the centre of the table, because that's the bit that's been missing sometimes in those formal processes.
Thanks, Caroline. That was a brilliantly quotable answer. I think the idea of putting the voice that's least heard at the centre is really powerful. Tom, would you like to come in here? I realise that Transport for London's powers are different to local authority powers.
I mean, I think one of the things when we were working through this report from the perspective of the landowner is slightly the hope that there can be sort of objectively set or external sources of what governance structures between landowners and communities can look like, so that when we go and start to engage with people, we don't feel like we're imposing a governance structure on community groups. but equally that community groups aren't forced to kind of come up with something when they come up against a large bureaucracy like TfL that does like to have kind of order and things kind of mapped out. I think there are kind of middle grounds to that, and it's all about trying to pool those bits of knowledge. And maybe that other way of looking around the edges of the local authorities control to those landowners and finding ways of getting in touch. It's not always easy, but having a landowner on board often opens up slightly different kinds of doors with the local planning authority. So it can be a way of, you need the right landlords and landowners, but yeah.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'd like to pick up from Tom's point there and now link a couple of questions that people have been asking in the chat. So apologies to questioners for slightly collaging your questions together about property ownership and vacant units. The first part of that is, should there be a power for communities to take over vacant buildings or land which has a negative social value, which is referenced a little bit in our report, and linked to that, something that I certainly come across. It's often quite hard to identify if you are in a position where the property is vacant or isn't being used very well. Who actually owns it, and what those ownership structures can be quite opaque in order to then engage them with discussions about the future. So is part of the issue here about transparency of ownership as well as being about what we do if properties are empty, full stop. Caroline, I wonder if that's something that's come up for you in Islington.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ownership of property is it's incredibly opaque, and particularly in a place like Islington where you have very absent landlords, who don't live in the country, who have 14 layers of kind of corporate governance between you and the actual owner. So I think it is, as Vidhya says, kind of where a partnership between a community community activists and the council is absolutely critical to it, because it is about trying to get to the end of that chain. I think the other thing that I would say is around skills and capacity, and it's building a bit on what Tom has said, is I also think that it's about kind of equipping communities and giving access to communities to the kind of knowledge and expertise that they need to kind of solve these conundrums in terms of asset management and asset development and kind of ownership. So it is about making sure that we work with organisations, so for Northern Ireland, I've worked with people like the Development Trust, who are very closely aligned to locality here in the UK, and really kind of, helping communities ask local authorities really difficult blooming questions. So to the point where you're kind of going, oh, for goodness sake, but actually that's the absolute right question you should ask. So for me, there's something as well about kind of putting alongside, urban designers, lawyers, all of those people who can help communities kind of formulate the right path to the ownership that they seek.
Fantastic, thanks, Caroline. Tom, I wonder if there's something that comes up for you in terms of neighbouring properties that are adjacent to TfL land.
Yeah, but probably ought to be completely transparent. Our own property ownership records are pretty complicated as well. And you'll find that the people who are in there might be under several versions of a sublet to a landlord who you haven't heard from for a huge period of time. On our larger sites, it's often a case of there's an urgency to transform them into housing or mixed-use sites when we have existing tenants on parts of the sites, which means we can't do something comprehensive. We have to take a kind of really long-term view and leave little bits of land still not part of a development. From an urban perspective, and as we sit through design review, that always comes up as a criticism. I think for me, there's a slight reassurance about that working in a piecemeal way allows something to happen at a smaller scale that can influence something in the future, and that these different uses can work together. The stuff of having neighbouring land and different land owners wishing that we could kind of create slightly unified things, that tends to exist quite early in our projects. But actually the complexity of that urban environment, it makes our teams think a lot harder about what they're doing. I think if you were able to just have a completely, as a big landowner, if you're able to have a completely simplified map of who owns what and how to get hold of it, I think that would actually limit the local responsiveness of designs and schemes. So from the point of view of a master planner, I actually think there's value in that. But from the point of view of the high street, that complexity of being a community trying to grapple with that impossibility is, I don't know, it's vertiginous. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. It's so interesting hearing some different potential perspectives on that. Vidhya, obviously, community businesses are as close as you can possibly get, as far as you can possibly get from having opaque and complex ownership structures. But I wonder if this issue of delinquent ownership comes up much with the community businesses that you work with.
It does. And I mean, I think we need a massive push on transparency in terms of beneficial ownership, and we should all be pressuring the government to deliver on its commitments to create these registers for beneficial ownership. So they have, they did actually commit to doing that, and it hasn't progressed at all. So that is something that we should all be pushing for. What we've seen work well, for example, in Bradford, is the local authority playing a brokerage role. So picking up on what Caroline said, and working with community businesses to approach landlords. So even where you do know who the landlord is, it can often be challenging for a community business and small organisation to sort of approach potentially a larger pension fund or something like that. So the local authority can play an important brokerage role, I think, in that context. And I think we would also support the recommendations in your report, Claire, around more powers for local authorities to not just CPO powers to take ownership, but also the potential to rent property, to force the rental of properties that are unused, and where that is causing significant deterioration for the local high street. That actually, as curators of the high street, I think we need more powers for local authorities to be able to do things and to deal with owners who don't want to play ball, who are really interested in the long-term success of a place. So I think those recommendations have potentially got a lot of power in them.
Fantastic, thanks, Vidhya. There were so many interesting questions, and we're not going to get through all of them because we only have 3 minutes. 3 minutes of this webinar left, and I'm sure I'm between many of you and your lunches, which is not a good place to be. But before we close, I'd just like to ask each of our panelists for Vidhya's already touched on this, and so is Caroline. We've talked a lot about what communities can do, but what would be the one thing that you would ask central government to do to support the vitality of our high streets in the very challenging year or two ahead? So Tom, if I could come to you first.
This won't be as detailed and informed as either Vidhya or Caroline's answer, but make it easy and make little pots of money accessible to small community groups, small interventions as a way of beginning to understand the processes of the high street and beginning to engage with it in a meaningful way, like getting that foot in the door for a community that can then lead over time to greater involvement. Make it easy.
Thanks, Tom. Caroline, could I come to you next?
I support Tom's, and I think the other one for me would be about oh my goodness, it would be about I mean, the planning one is just enormous for us, and I think that kind of how we engage with landlords and how we really embed social value in our high street. So I suppose my ask of government would be to see the power of assets in vidhyaing and driving social value at a local level is so critical and can be done in so many different ways.
Thanks, Caroline. And Vidhya, if you'd like to build on what you've already said, or maybe you feel that was enough.
No, I would just say, I mean, I think we need to move away from this crazy competitive approach to supporting local regeneration, whether it's, we've got these large scale funds that are all competitive. There's no access for community organisations directly to any of them, and actually coordinating them to make something sensible happen in a local area is incredibly difficult, and it's getting worse. There's more of them coming on stream, the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Renewal Fund. I mean, how you make sense of all of that in a single place is kind of beyond me, but we're caught in this approach now of everything being controlled by Westminster and Whitehall, and these competitive processes that local authorities have to go through, I think that isn't going to lead to a sensible regeneration of local places, unfortunately. So changing that as well as PDR would be my big asks.
Thanks, Vidhya, and thanks to all of our panelists for such an interesting conversation today. It's been really great to have you with us. And thank you again to my colleagues, particularly Joe and Nikita and the events team who brought this together today and make everything run incredibly smoothly in the background, so I don't need to worry about this stuff. We're hugely grateful. And thanks to our funders, Good Growth Partner Transport for London, funders the National Association of Local Councils and Power to Change, and major sponsors, the Greater London Authority and Primera. All that remains for me to say is that we have more research and webinars coming up this year. In particular, we're gearing up for our Countdown to Net Zero London conference in just over a month on the 29th of June, talking about lots of interesting things that might be relevant to this audience, in particular how the green jobs agenda can shape London's local economy and provide opportunities for the people who need them most. Needless to say, if you are interested in funding this or anything else that we do, please do get in touch. And thank you very much again to our speakers, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.